Hi there, my name is Joel, and this here, let's review The Last of Us Part 2.
Shut up.
All right, calm down.
Now, my name really is Joel. This isn't really how I talk, though, so I'm gonna go back to talking like a normal person, and I need to be able to see, so I'm gonna wear these as well. Originally, this whole gig was gonna be done outside, but it's over 100 and something degrees out there, and it's gonna get warmer, and I don't feel like melting. So, The Last of Us Part 2, it's a game that has a weird amount of buzz around, both positive and negative. People who haven't even played it are defending it to their last breath or ready to burn everyone involved at the stake. That's kind of weird. I mean, I get this is a weird time in human history, but good God. So, let's dive into whether or not this game is actually worth your $60 or not. Now, right off the bat, I want to hit you with my personal biases that I'm bringing into this review, because whether we like it or not, video games are basically art, so they're subjective, and it's about whether or not you enjoy it. We can talk about the technical level of it, and the skill that went into it, and the craftsmanship all day long, but someone who didn't use nearly as much craftsmanship and ingenuity might actually make a game that you enjoy more than one that's made with the utmost cutting-edge technology. So ultimately, you have to sort of weigh those two things. So here's the bias I'm bringing in. I am a married adult man. I am former U.S. Army infantry, and my name is Joel. So, with topics like vengeance, war, love, violence, and people named Joel, I have opinions that you might not. And the game also touches on things like PTSD and stuff like that, which, I have some passing knowledge on, having it personally and knowing people who also have it. So, we'll get to that when we get to it. I'm going to try to make this as quick as possible, because ultimately, you probably have $60 burning a hole in your pocket. So let's figure out what you should do with it. Now, The Last of Us, the first game, was pretty groundbreaking because it really showed how cool and narrative stories could be. I mean, it felt like you were playing a movie over the course of multiple hours. And that was kind of the first time people gave credit to video games for doing that. So no matter what this game does, no one can take away your love for the original game. Okay? I'm going to go spoiler-free at first, and then we're going to dive right in at the end. So, I'll warn you beforehand. This game is technically very well made. It's graphically beautiful, the gameplay is a solid improvement to what came before, and the level design is impressive. There's a lot of world building done that, from a creative standpoint, makes me very happy, because it's really cool to see time progress through this fictional alternate history, or future, as it were, and to see how society changes, what different organizations pop up. The Fireflies and the Hunters are gone because they're in a different part of the United States, and time has passed. So the main factions you have are the group at Jackson, which are like basically Wild West settlers. You have the Wolves, which are the Washington Liberation Front, and so they call themselves Wolves because of the acronym. And you have Scars, or Seraphites, which is based on the term seraphim, which is the term for a six-winged angel in the Bible. So before I go any further, I'm just going to go ahead and say that I know that there are rumors out there, and I'm going to tell you what I heard and then tell you whether or not they're real. I heard that The Last of Us Part 2, you play as Joel and Ellie for the first half of the game, then halfway through, you're brutally executed and murdered by a gender-fluid She-Hulk, who you then play as the protagonist for the rest of the game, finding out that vengeance was a bad idea all along. And I'm happy to say that a lot of that isn't true, but a lot of it shares DNA with what does happen. And to go forward, I'm going to have light spoilers and then major spoilers. So I'm just going to start off as light as I can. The story does take place with two different protagonists. Ellie is who you play as for the first half of it, and then you play as a character named Abby, who's a brand new character. And both of them have gameplay differences, which is nice, because you feel like you're playing with someone with more physical prowess as Abby, or someone who's a little bit more violent and brutal when you're Ellie. The level design is impressive. It starts off kind of boring, and they toy with the idea of open worlds that never really builds into anything. They give you sort of these pocket worlds that you can explore. And they're fun, but they still want you to play it X, Y, and Z. You can't really go outside of the way they want you to solve those problems. And you don't really get to be creative in it. The gameplay is solid. I know that it hasn't really evolved much from the original game, but if it's not broken, don't fix it. I had a blast with it. The gameplay is still fun. Cover-based shooting is fun. Sneaking around, crafting, scavenging for resources. There's a lot to do, and they've improved on it. And in the level design, it starts off maybe a little bit boring, but in the back half of the game especially, there's a lot of verticality where you might be in a boat and then you get to an area, and so you're clearing out the area, and you can jump from the second story down into water, swim underneath a bunch of areas, and then pop up, and you have a new tactical advantage, and you can just keep popping up, and you're really hard to track down. And on top of that, they have sliders to change the difficulty of the game. So you can improve your health, NPC health, their awareness, their aggression, your NPC, if you have an extra character, sometimes in parts of the story there is a follower, their aggressiveness and their willingness to take on enemies and stuff like that, or the amount of stuff you can find in the world. And that's all pretty neat. That being said, this game to me feels like driving in one of the nicest cars on one of the nicest roads to a destination I never wanted to go to. And that's a big problem with the game that I think a lot of the Divide is really about. Is that the advertising made it sound like it was going to be another story about Joel and Ellie working together and moving through this desolate, sad world and bonding and sticking together and watching how their interactions change throughout all of it. And instead, it isn't that at all. And this is where I'm going to get into mild spoilers about the plot. Only like the first hour or so, and I'm going to leave the rest of it and most of the twists and turns for you to experience if you so choose to buy the game. Joel dies really early on. I know a lot of people have a problem with that, but it is the initiating instance that pushes the plot forward. And I don't have a problem with Joel dying, because his choice of what he did in the first game wasn't necessarily the right choice, but what the Fireflies were doing wasn't right either. The game does a really good job, both the old and the new, at showing the gray area of people. The fact that good people will choose to do bad things and bad people will choose to do good things. And that no one is 100% either one of those things. And in a world where people are being canceled for things they did when they were young and stupid, or things when they just didn't understand the full context of their actions, that's a message everyone needs. And so no matter how much the game made me mad, I couldn't hate it because, aside from being technically well made, it had a good message that a lot of people need to hear. So it's really hard to stay mad at it when it's telling people something they kind of need to know. Unfortunately, that message gets buried underneath a very heavy-handed message that revenge is just bad. The game does a really good job of showing how Ellie and Abby are basically the same character. They've both lost a father figure, they've both been pushed into revenge, and their bodies have been shaped and scarred by their attempts to find revenge and hope that it brings them closure. And it doesn't really bring either of them happiness or closure, and they both lose a lot of their friends and family along that journey to try and find revenge, which they think will make them happy, and ultimately it doesn't. And while I like the story telling you that revenge is bad, it seems to do it like you're a baby. Like you've never heard of the idea not to hurt someone else, or that revenge is bad, or that violence isn't a good thing. And to quote Westworld, these violent delights have violent ends. And there are actually a lot of, well, at least a few Westworld actors that are in this game. Jeffrey Wright plays Isaac, the leader of the Wolves, who shows that the Wolves, while initially seen as the bad guys because the people who killed Joel are from there, they are the closest a civilization has ever come to being rebuilt and fully functional. So you kind of want to root for them to win, but at the same time, Isaac is not above torturing people horribly in order to get information and maintain that that area will be safe. And it makes you wonder how far is too far as what you're willing to trade to make society work again. And the Scars, or the Seraphites, are a religious extremist cult. And I know a lot of people were worried that some caricature of Christianity was what the cult would be, but if this organization is any resemblance to an organization that you call your religion, you might want to call the police, because ritual sacrifice and gutting people is kind of a horrible thing, and last time I checked it was illegal. Admittedly, I haven't gone outside in several weeks, so things could have changed. I think there was a lot of people ready to be offended by this game before it even released, and there was definitely a lot of rumors that had me on edge. I walked into this thing ready to hate it, but hoping that I wouldn't. And I walked out of it wishing it was better, but enjoying a lot of it. So it's really hard. It's a mixed bag, and just like the characters that it represents, there's a lot to love and a lot to like, and it does a lot right, then it also fumbles in a lot of really major ways. The violence in it, for one thing, is over the top. When you shoot someone, they'll writhe in pain and scream and gargle and arch their back and flail. And their friends will call out their name, not just, "They killed one of the guys," which you can hear in other games, but they'll scream out, George, Terry, Martha, why did you say that name? And it makes you feel bad about killing random NPCs. And I understand why they did that, because the whole point is supposed to be that you're going too far and that you're becoming kind of a monster, that you're doing bad things. And it's true, you are doing bad things. You're committing acts of murder on people who seem bad to you, but then when you play as the other character, you see the other side of them, and you see why they are or aren't a good person or a bad person. But I think it went a little too far. I think it tried a little too hard to get people's attention. It went way out of its way to show violence in a visceral, horrible way. And for some desensitized people playing video games, maybe that's what it took. And if that's the case, then hey, I guess it was worth it. But for someone like me, I know I don't want to watch someone be brutally tortured. And on top of that, Ellie, one of the playable characters, becomes this horrifying husk of a person completely consumed by rage. And most of her personality is still intact in flashback levels where you play as her with Joel. And unfortunately, the great writing in that just proves what we all wanted the game to be. We wanted more of Joel and Ellie, and more of them exploring the world and being tested as a relationship of a father and daughter. Or we wanted a completely different game. And this is a mixture of both, and it's never really good at being one or the other, because you can't have both at the same time without something getting messy. And this gets messy, unfortunately. Ultimately, whether or not you like The Last of Us Part 2 may boil down to how easily you can open up to Abby being the protagonist of the game. Because while Ellie's writing may have been lacking, Abby was an incredibly well-written character, maybe the best of both games. And while I was hesitant to be Team Abby after what she does in the beginning of the game, by the end of the game, every choice Ellie had made had frustrated me, but almost every choice Abby had made felt like one that I would make too, and she was sympathetic and likable. And whether or not I like the game as a sequel to The Last of Us Part 1 aside, as a standalone game about Abby, it's incredibly well made, and her story alone makes the game worth playing. And I think that's where a lot of the issue comes from. It's a well-made game that chooses to take you down bad places. It's a AAA game with AA writing. The gameplay is great. The level design is competent. The motion capture and performance is phenomenal. No actor in this looks like a weak link in the machine. But they're doing these things competently to take you down a path you don't want to go. And the feeling of guilt they want you to feel never resonates, because the choices are made for you. Choices like going with your friend to make sure that he's safe, or chasing someone down for revenge, you don't get to make that choice. Ellie does. Whether or not to torture someone, Ellie decides that. Whether or not you have to kill multiple people and dogs, that's a choice made by the game and not by you. So when the game tries to tell you that that choice was bad, you usually just end up agreeing and saying, yeah, I wouldn't have done that. So you didn't teach me anything, because I know not to do that. And you haven't taught the game character anything, because they don't know it's a game. So it becomes this frustrating monster. It feels like they made a game about Abby, and they made her character, and they made it really interesting, but they needed you to hate her initially so they could teach you that the people you hate aren't always bad people. And unfortunately, the way they did it wasn't done with the same level of finesse that you could have seen in other places. That's not to say the game is bad, because again, it's really well made. It's beautiful, and it has a lot of elements in the story and a lot of messages that people do need to hear right now. While far from a perfect game, few franchises in any medium manage to introduce a monster or a creature and make it just as scary in the follow-up as it was in the original, something that The Last of Us Part 2 does incredibly well, if not making them even scarier. Whether you're Ellie on your own, with limited resources, or if you're playing as Abby, rolling deep with the rest of your wolf squad, the infected always feel like a genuine threat, and the boss fights are some of the most fun I've had in maybe any game ever. It makes it difficult to judge a game when the plot points for one character and all of her friends are so poorly written, and all of the gameplay and the plot for the other character is so incredibly well designed. It makes you wonder if they had two totally different writing teams, or if they were written in two totally different phases. But at the end of the day, as much as I don't want people to pay full price for The Last of Us Part 2, I absolutely want them to play it, because few games offer this kind of gameplay, this much fun, such an incredibly competent world building, and such interesting characters. So it's a real mixed bag, and ultimately whether or not it connects with you or if it's worth your time will really come down to how much violence you're okay with, how much self-loathing you're willing to endure, and if you're willing to put up with the characters you liked in the first game kind of being hollow and shallow versions of who they used to be, while introducing way more interesting characters in the follow-up that you'll ultimately end up caring for way more, and whether or not you're willing to give up on them and adopt these new characters as the ones you're going to follow for the rest of the franchise. If you liked the first game, if you want a dark story, if you want competent storytelling, if you want good performances, if you want great gameplay, scary boss fights, incredible visual spectacle, and you want a story that challenges your point of view, then you're probably going to enjoy this game. And yeah, it's worth getting. But if you wanted a game that had Joel and Ellie as a main team going through all of this, that shows them being tested and coming together, or if you wanted something that maybe offered a glimmer of hope for the characters that you learned to love in the first game, you're going to be sorely disappointed whenever you pick up The Last of Us Part 2. And whether or not that's a good idea is up to you, because some people like hearing a story even if it's sad and even if it hurts them, because it's worth hearing. And some people just want to feel like they're safe and like all the work and the pain they went through is worthwhile. So that should help inform what you're doing. If you like The Last of Us and you're kind of upset about The Last of Us Part 2 and you're not sure if you want to get it yet, or if you just want to wait for it to go on sale, check out Days Gone. It's made by Ben Studios, and it's got Sam Witwer as the title character of Deacon St. John, and his name is probably the most ridiculous part of the game. It's got an incredible open world, great gameplay mechanics, crafting, and just like the clickers are a very original take on an outbreak or some type of zombie type of paraphernalia, they have a really original look on it, where instead of someone dying and being reanimated, it's essentially a virus that's like super rabies, and you have these super shredded, very muscle-dense, crazy people, and there's a whole really well-made world, and it's very dark, but it doesn't torture you with how dark it is. And it's one of Sam Witwer's best performances in a game, and that's from someone who loved the Force Unleashed games, and who's played pretty much every Star Wars game, so he's in each of those as at least one or two characters. So the game has a lot of controversy. If you play part of it and you decide you don't want to finish it, that's fine. You can say that the game is bad. And if you played part of it and you haven't finished it but you are convinced the game is good, that's fine too. Unlike people online, I'm not going to tell you that you have to finish the game to know if it's bad or good. I don't have to finish a meal to know that it tastes bad. But I think there are parts worth finding and sifting through in it. Just like getting to know a person who's rough around the edges. They'll have something worth remembering and worth having. It's just whether or not you're willing to go through all the pain and the turmoil and what can sometimes feel like a chore of playing through the game in order to get to those parts. So hopefully that helps you decide whether or not you're going to get the game. Personally, I think it's worth playing, just not at full price. And again, Days Gone has pretty much everything I wanted in a game made like The Last of Us, without the gratuitous torture porn and emotional turmoil and heavy-fisted messages about revenge equals bad, because I already know that. Both games are worth checking out, and no matter what you think of either game, they're your opinion. And if there's one thing to take away, it's that you shouldn't let hate consume you. If someone has a different opinion about you on something, they're games. It's really not worth arguing with someone online about. I mean, you can have a conversation and say why you disagree, but remember that it's not worth letting your blood pressure rise or your blood boil over it. No one's going to take away the first game, and no one's telling you that the game is awful or that it's great. Only you can decide that, because it's subjective. For me, it was worth playing, but not worth $60. Thanks for listening, and I hope this was helpful. Be sure to check out other stuff we're doing. We have a story with Batman, and Kevin Conroy's in it, and that's pretty neat. So check that out on the Poppycock podcast website, on our YouTube channel, on our social media, whatever. Find us. We're podcasts, we're videos, we're everything. We're everywhere. We're even under your bed. So we'll know if you do or don't play this game. Let that sink in. Bye.